We appreciate all of the guests who have appeared on our show and sincerely thank them for providing you, our audience, with useful information. However, the advice our guests provide is theirs, and we encourage you to seek out a professional if you have specific questions about any topic we cover on the Crushing Debt podcast. On this week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast, Fortress Asset Protection.
Welcome to the Crushing Debt Podcast with your host, Florida attorney Sean Yesner, where our goal is to help you get rid of the financial bullies in your life.
So welcome back to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. My name is Sean Yesner, owner and founder of Yesner Law, and I have a guest that I am excited about this week. Real quick, as I do every week before I get to my guest, I do want to tell you all about the show's sponsor, Sam Cohen with Attorneys First Insurance. And for those of you that don't know Sam by now, he writes errors and omissions insurance or malpractice insurance for attorneys and title companies all over the state of Florida. He's also got a particular focus right now also on Texas. And so if you are an attorney or title company, if you know an attorney or title company, and you're in Florida or Texas or anywhere in the country, give Sam a buzz. You can reach him, sam@attorneysfirst.com or www.attorneysfirst.com. Sam will take good care of you. Let him know you heard him on the Crushing Debt podcast, or you heard me talking about him on the Crushing Debt podcast. But regardless of how you heard about him, he will give you an apples to apples comparison. So with that, I want to take I don't want to take too much time. I do want to get to my guest this week, who's an attorney that I've known here for quite a while. And so I'm sorry it's taken so long to get him on the show here. But Michelangelo Mortellaro is an estate planning and elder law attorney. He's been practicing now since 2007. He has his own law firm, Mortellaro Law. And he's also got another, company that I didn't even realize that we're going to talk about called Fortress Asset Protection. So we'll get into all of that. You can reach him either at Mortellaro Law, which is MORTELLARO Law, LAW.com, or FortressAssetProtection.com. So with all of that, welcome, Michelangelo.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity. Good to see you.
Yeah. So you do estate planning law, elder law. So, death and taxes, right? The only two things that are for certain, death and taxes. Why don't we just start real basic? Why is it important to have an estate plan?
Sure. Well, there's two things that we plan for in estate planning. The first is disability and incapacity planning. And then the second are the traditional notions of, who's in charge of my estate when I pass away and who are my beneficiaries, and are there any rules about getting my stuff to my beneficiaries? And I think many people think about estate planning only with respect to where does my stuff go when I pass away. But because of our focus on elder law, we deal with a lot of people that are getting older, their health is deteriorating, and they may find themselves in need of in-home health care, assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing. All of that stuff costs a lot of money, and most people don't have insurance to cover it, so it's somewhat self-pay. So a lot of what we do in the elder law section is we preserve your assets in the event that you get dementia, you have the stroke, you fall and break the hip when we get older, and those things sometimes happen. You could be looking at an $18,000 a month nursing home bill. For many folks, if you're there for any length of time, you can decimate your entire estate, in which case leaving behind nothing to those people that you care most about. So on the disability and capacity planning, we set up our clients to be able to legally and legitimately shelter their excess income and assets for public benefits such as Medicaid and veterans benefits, so that we can get those services that we need and the care that we need subsidized or sometimes paid in full through government benefits, while still legally preserving our assets and our extra income for our personal needs for the rest of our life, and eventually down to our family and our beneficiaries.
Yeah, and although even though it's elder law, I don't consider myself elder, but it could apply to me. It could apply to anybody, right?
We're all on the express train to Oldville. So yes, we're getting there. But yes, to your point, everybody remembers the Terri Schiavo case, terrible case in the state of Florida, going back 20 years now. Terri Schiavo was like 27 years old when she suffered a major medical crisis that rendered her in a persistent vegetative state. So while normally we think about elder law or special needs planning, when we get old, and that's always a moving target. As we get older, we always seem to kick the can down the road and define what old means to a later date. But that's a classic example, national media attention, where it could happen to anyone at any time. So it's important for even the younger folks to plan for their future potential disability incapacity. And once we have children, like that opens it up even more. Now we're not only responsible for ourselves, but we have little people that we're responsible financially and medically to take care of. So estate planning is great at any age. Most people kick the can down the road. Sometimes they kick it a little too late and they pass away before they ever plan. And then, I have a video on my website. It's called Probates for Suckers. I say that a little tongue in cheek. Right now, I have like 97 probates running concurrently in my office, but probate just makes lawyers money. And while we're all in business to make money and profit's not a dirty word, I tell my clients, I want you to like me, but I don't want you to like me that much where you're taking your hard-earned money and at the end of life, you're giving it to me instead of your children or your beneficiaries.
Right. And I think that's one of the biggest issues is while we're younger, we tend to believe we're invincible. So, we don't, nothing ever bad is going to happen to me. And then even now I notice I'm, a year and a few months from being 50 and I'm noticing things don't work as well as they used to. So, it is. And then, like you said, I got 2 kids. And so, when those start coming and you start thinking about, well, I've got life insurance, but beyond that, what else is going to happen? And so, I know we throw out all these terms. And so for those that are unfamiliar, when you die without a will, that's called intestate. When you die with a will, that's testate. But then I know there's a big misconception out there that people say, well, I got a will, so I don't need to worry about probate. But that's actually reverse, right?
At least in the state of Florida, and I believe in other states as well, the last will and testament is your roadmap through the probate process. It tells the judge, who do I want in charge of my estate, known as either a personal representative or an executor. And it says, who are my beneficiaries and do we have any rules about getting my stuff to my beneficiary? So for instance, you have a 2-year-old child and you want that child to be your sole beneficiary. That sounds great on paper, but functionally and administratively, how does a 2-year-old inherit your house, inherit your IRA? They can't manage money. They can't contract. So that's where trust planning, I think, becomes very crucial, is when we're dealing with beneficiaries who are either minors or are defined as a special needs person, someone who may be on public benefits now or in the future. Or, listen, every family has its dynamics. We have drug and alcohol problems. We have mental illness. We have general irresponsibility when it comes to money. Through proper trust planning, not only can we legitimately avoid probate versus going through the process, we have a lot more flexibility and control over our assets even after we pass away. How do we get them there? How do we protect that money? You mentioned life insurance. That's great. I'm a big fan of term life insurance, even though it doesn't pay out statistically often. When you have a minor child, it's cheap. You can get $1 million of term insurance for $60 or $70 a month if you're relatively healthy. So you get $2 million of term insurance, and then all of a sudden you pass away. And what do you name your 5-year-old as the beneficiary? Like, what does that look like? Who's in charge of the money? Those present challenges for parents of young children or disabled beneficiaries that a good estate plan can all work through.
Yeah, and I know you touched on it a little bit. There are issues when minors get involved, especially, in my realm in real estate law. I've had people ask me from time to time, well, should I put my minor son on title, or minor daughter, minor child on title in case something happens to me? And the answer in almost every case is absolutely not, because if you put your minor child on title and then anybody ever wants to sell that house, you got to appoint a guardian. Even if dad dies and mom is still alive and mom is the natural parent of the child, you still have to appoint a guardian. And that guardian could potentially be mom, but you still have to go through the court process, appoint the guardian so that mom can address whatever's going on with the house. I can only imagine in a probate situation, it would be even more complicated than that.
Absolutely. So the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, many states have adopted, and there's a set dollar figure. And if you're leaving more than that dollar figure to a minor, even though, as you mentioned, the natural parent or adoptive parent may still be in the picture, they need to get a guardianship over the property for their own child. That requires an attorney, that requires filing and court appearances and restricted accounts. And every time they want to use that money for their minor child, they basically have to call the lawyer. The lawyer has to petition the court. The court has to have a hearing, and then it's either approved or denied. And so it's just unnecessary administrative red tape that can all be avoided through proper estate and most notably trust planning.
Yeah, and so I do want to touch on trust planning for a little bit. Really, the only type of trust that I've ever dealt with is a Florida land trust, which is specifically designed to hold a piece of property. I don't really deal with trusts beyond that. So I know we've got revocable trusts, we've got irrevocable trusts, we've got spendthrift trusts, we've got all these other different kinds of trusts. Can you take a minute just to go over I mean, we all know, I think, trustee beneficiary, but sort of beyond that, the basics of what are some of the differences between the various types of trusts?
So the two general types of trust, as you mentioned, revocable or revocable, depending on if you're a tomato person, right. Yeah. Or irrevocable or irrevocable. Really, 99% of folks who are talking about an estate plan are usually talking about a revocable trust. It provides the most amount of flexibility and control. You can be in charge of your own assets or your own checkbook. You can also be your own beneficiary. So that's what we talk about for estate planning. Now, importantly, many people have the misconception that if I have a revocable trust, that all of a sudden I have this asset protection vehicle. And I tell people, revocable trusts are probate avoidance tools, not asset protection tools. So very big distinction. When we talk about asset protection tools and trusts, we're usually talking about irrevocable trust. We can be talking about irrevocable life insurance trusts, which if the estate tax exemption on the federal level dips down to as low as I think it might in the near future, more people are going to be wanting to think about those things because not to go off on a tangent, but the federal estate tax exemption limit does actually count the death benefit of your life insurance. So if you have a $2 million life insurance policy, there may be some of your death benefit that's actually going to Uncle Sam to pay inheritance taxes. So what you think might be going to your family partially might be going to the government. So we can use irrevocable life insurance trust to help that. But generally speaking, we use irrevocable trust for veterans. I have a veterans asset protection trust. I have a Medicaid asset protection trust. We have other types of irrevocable trusts that would actively act as a barrier that if you got sued or your children got sued, that if the trust is properly drafted and funded, we can kind of prevent creditors from breaching those assets and taking them for even valid debts.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, in my world, that's one of the most common questions that I'm asked is that if I die, do my heirs owe my debts? And the answer is in most cases no, unless one of the heirs is a co-signer or something like that. But what you're talking about is even beyond that. What if later so someone passes away, there's money in the estate, and then one of the heirs becomes 16 and is driving around and gets into a car accident and seriously hurts someone and gets sued? Can they invade the assets of the trust to pay those personal injury damages at that point?
Correct. Those are things we get all of the time, especially for new drivers, because those are problematic. In fact, there's a Fortress client that we have, a terrible situation, but I think it really sheds light on this. This gentleman, single dad, he owned 22 pieces of rental property, all paid off. So no mortgages on any of them. He was doing quite well. He had about $8.5 million of real property. Wow. He owned his own business. Every year, if he had a good year, he would just buy a property cash. And he always knew, like, one day I should probably go see a lawyer because, like, having him in my own name's probably not my best move. Always put it off, always put it off. Well, son is 17 years old, asked to borrow the BMW for a high school party. Dad gets to knock on the door at 3:00 in the morning. His son's being charged with DUI manslaughter.
Wow.
Not a good day under any circumstances, but it got a whole lot worse. This gentleman had a $250,000, $500,000 automobile policy, which is pretty robust for most folks. And he had $1 million umbrella policy on top of that, which if you don't know what that is, I highly recommend you talk to your insurance professional. Those are really good and they're very inexpensive. So for most of us driving around thinking like we have $1.5 million worth of automobile insurance, like that's going to cover the fender bender, no problem. Well, this gentleman ended up with a $12.5 million judgment against him personally. Wow. And so, of course, in doing a very quick Lexus, asset search for $25 on the lawyers have access to, the plaintiff's attorney in the personal injury case found 22 pieces of property unprotected and paid off. So they said, Judge, we have a $12.5 million judgment. This guy has $8.5 million of real property. Can we have it? And the judge said, yes, indeed, you can have it. So this guy, not only in dealing with the fallout of his son's life being forever changed by this event, lost $8.5 million of current assets. But now for those real property investors out there, not carrying debt service on it, what are those properties worth in rents over the next 20 years?
Right. Wow.
He lost all of it as well. So that's the poster child on a big scale for Fortress. But really, you could have one piece of property, and that's where things happen. And we have found that so many people are undereducated and underprotected when it comes to asset protection.
Yeah. And so that actually is a good transition, because I do want to talk a little bit about not only Fortress asset protection, but one of the other things you mentioned that I'm sure you go through, I go through as well, especially, owning Yesner Law. So now I've got my own things to worry about, but not only that, I've got to worry about, well, what happens to Yesner Law if something happens to me? What happens to my business if something happens to me? And then, on top of that, we can also get into Fortress asset protection to that company as well. But maybe talk for a little bit about what we have to plan for as owners of businesses, not necessarily lawyers, but owners of businesses. We've got some estate planning we've got to do there as well. Absolutely.
So the problem that most folks have is that, 82% of business owners don't have any estate plan at all. And that's not only on the personal side, but on the corporate side as well. And so a lot of the country is made up of these small business owners. A lot of them are sole proprietors. They're single member LLCs or other entities. And so business owners, even when they're really good at building and running a business, are often so consumed with building and running a business, they never take a step back and think about obviously what happens if I die, or when I die, if I still own the business, what if I become disabled? What if I can't work in my business anymore? And then it gets more complicated. What if you have a business partner or partners that also own shares in the business? What happens if you can't work anymore? Is it fair for you to take your percentage of profits if you're not contributing? Some would say not. How do we extract the value of your ownership interest, whether in whole or in part, of a business and get it to those people most important to you? So just brought on a probate last week. A gentleman passed away unexpectedly, owned a $3 million business, and that's just inventory. That's not going concern value, and didn't have any succession planning for his business. He has a wife, he has 2 children, but $3 million of his business of his estate is now going through probate, 6 to 12 months. The business is effectively shut down because he was the only signer on the checking account. So the employees aren't getting paid. How long do you think they're going to come to work? The rent's not getting paid. How long before they padlock the front door? And so at the end of 12 months, what is that $3 million business going to be worth? Well, it's usually going to be used furniture, fixtures, and equipment, because the phone stopped ringing a long time ago. And so that's a problem. And that $3 million business might turn into a $200,000 business at the end of 12 months. and everything that guy worked so hard to build kind of goes away.
Yeah. I've got an example of that as well. I've got a client of mine, a friend of mine, who recently passed away, and same kind of thing. It was a little bit more complicated because he had created other businesses complementary to the main business, and had even talked to me, and I did some of his corporate documents, and had talked to me about, I'm going to bring on these partners, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and then suddenly he's gone. None of those, I don't have the information for any of those partners. We don't have corporate documents for any of those partners. So now all these other complementary businesses that could have been tremendous businesses are gone. And this whole structure that he had is done. And it's, we're doing what we can to salvage everything. I'm still coming at it from the corporate perspective. He had another attorney. Otherwise, I would have called you about the probate aspects of it. They had another family attorney, but it's the same kind of thing. It's scary stuff. If you own a business and you do not have some type of estate plan or at least succession plan, and I know if you have partners, you can do life insurance policies, because the other issue there is, and again, the analogy doesn't quite work for law firms. We've got a few different rules there, but the analogy is, if I have a partner in my business and I die, my partner may not want to run that business with my wife. Or if my partner dies, I don't want to run the business with his wife or with his 16-year-old kid or with, that or the other thing. So, I agree. Estate planning and succession planning, especially when you're dealing with a business, is extremely important. But I want to turn my focus a little bit to fortress asset protection. So something that you have a particular involvement in, and me too, from a certain perspective, is asset protection, especially with me from the bankruptcy side, and then you from the estate planning side. So I didn't realize this. Fortress asset protection is its own entity and is a separate entity, right?
Absolutely.
So what is it? What does it do?
So Fortress Asset Protection is more of a consulting service. It's not a law firm. It is owned by two practicing attorneys, one on the business law side and one on the estate planning and elder law side, and I'm that guy. So what Fortress is we talk to a new client and we look at where are there areas of risk. And we're talking about risks specifically from lawsuits. And we identify the risk, and we figure out legally how can we mitigate the risk and build little bubbles around each area of risk, so that if something, as we call it, catches fire, that fire is contained in its own little box. And that little box might burn down, but that little box will prevent all your other stuff from catching fire. So we use a cruise ship analogy a lot of times, and I think this might be helpful. So you think about a cruise ship, it's got 2,000 people on board plus crew. Well, it's out in the middle of the ocean floating around. If something catastrophic happened, bad things are going to go down. Well, on a cruise ship, one of the catastrophic things could be a fire. Fires typically can happen in two areas of a cruise ship: the kitchen and the engine room. Those are things where there's open flames and hot things could catch fire. When engineers are designing cruise ships, they have firewalls that are built into these two areas, so that if the engine room catches fire, they can seal off those those areas and effectively starve the fire for oxygen. We shut it off and we make it airtight. The fire will just burn itself out. Now, you might lose propulsion and float around for a couple of days in the ocean, but you're probably not going to sink. So when we are talking with a business owner, and entrepreneurs are often serial entrepreneurs, as you mentioned with your client, they have multiple things going on. Each of those things might catch fire. And we want to make sure that if you have 22 rental properties, you have 22 areas of risk that something could catch fire. Specifically, just have a client on the other side that came to me. She was renting an Airbnb and they had a gas grill. And she went to go light up the gas grill and it exploded, causing second and third degree burns from her head to her toes. Wow. So she's asking me, do you know an attorney that can go after this property owner? Well, I happen to know one. I'm not that guy, but we all know people. So the point of that is, if you're an Airbnb owner and a lot of them have gas grills, that's an area literally and figuratively that a fire might happen. And so if you owned that Airbnb in your own name or just your rental, and something goes wrong and they sue you because it's not an entity, it's you, and they get a judgment, that fire is now going to spread to everything else in your life that's not locked down. Now, in Florida, there are things that are automatically asset protected. Your IRAs and qualified retirement accounts, your homestead, but there's a whole lot that's not. Your bank accounts, your non-qualified investment accounts, your businesses. People often, we look at liability from inside and outside liability and single member LLCs. So a lot of times people say, listen, I own a plumbing company. And so I'm the sole member of the LLC. And so if my plumbing company gets sued, I may have these corporate veil protections through the LLC where they can't get to my personal assets. That is a true statement, providing you've, corporate formalities.
Right.
But what they don't realize is, what if I get in a bar fight and I crack somebody in the head and they fall and break their neck and end up in a wheelchair, and now I get personally sued for those damages? Well, my automobile insurance isn't going to cover it. My homeowner's insurance isn't going to cover it. My business insurance isn't going to cover it. I'm on the hook. Now, they get a multi-million-dollar judgment against me personally. One of the things they're going to do is a deposition in aid of execution, and they're going to say, okay, tell me everything you own. Oh, I own a plumbing company. Really? Are you the only owner of the plumbing company? Yes, I am. All right. Hey, judge, this gentleman is a single member LLC, and for the law geeks out there, the Olmstead case in Florida indicates that if you have a single member LLC and you have a creditor, that creditor can sometimes foreclose on your interest of your business. So we look at asset protection not only if something blows up in your business, but what if it blows up in your personal life? And how do we prevent somebody suing you personally from taking your business or your rental properties? A million ways to do it. Multi-member, we do some offshore stuff. We do some anonymous. Well, I'd like to get into also anonymity planning, but there's ways to do it.
Okay. Well, yeah. Why don't we? Because that's an interesting topic. Is the anonymity. So again, sort of the analogy we talked about trusts, and again in my world, the land trust, and people mistake, like you said, revocable trusts for asset protection tools when they're really not. They may be anonymity tools, but they're not asset protection tools.
So a perfect plan has both, has anonymity and asset protection. When we talk about anonymity, really what we're talking about is getting your name off the public record as much as we can. And a land trust is a great option to do that, especially if you're buying the property in the land trust. Your name never even hits chain of title.
Right.
So it's great. If you already own a property and you want to put it in a land trust, well, people who know better can dig back in and try to figure out, and they'll probably figure out you probably still own it. However, if somebody types in, John Smith into the public records of your property appraiser's office and nothing hits besides maybe his homestead, which is protected, then one might assume he only owns a home. They may not know he owes 22 pieces of rental property in land trusts or LLCs that are properly configured. So we like to pull name off of title. I have a gentleman whose wife is a big Instagram superstar, and he has some safety concerns that people on the internet might be crazy, and they have a very unique last name. If you type in their last name to Hillsborough County, you will see where they live. And he has some safety concerns for his wife. So we were able to use a land trust for his own personal residence. He maintained his real estate exemptions, his property tax exemptions. But the point is, if you type in their last name in the Hillsborough County public records, you get nothing. So you can't even see where they live. Same for businesses. One of the downsides of being in Florida is that SunBiz is this wealth of information for business owners and for other people. So if you typed in, Sean Gesner in SunBiz, you're going to see anything that his name is associated with as far as a Florida entity. So what we do is to create anonymity in corporations and LLCs, we usually use a friendly state, Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, Alaska. Those are kind of the big ones. We like Wyoming for several reasons for small businesses. So what happens is you set up a Wyoming LLC. Now, unlike Florida, which requires the members to be listed on SunBiz, Wyoming only has something called an organizer, somewhat similar to like a registered agent. That person doesn't need to own any of the entity, but they can just be the face of the entity. So at Fortress, we have Fortress corporate services and corporate trustee. So we can act as that kind of registered agent. So we set up a Wyoming anonymous holding company. Wyoming holding company is then the only member of the Florida LLC. The Florida LLC owns your rental property, let's say. So if somebody gets hurt on your rental property, or let's say you have to evict a tenant and they're unhappy about that. So they're going to go to they're going to go to the Hillsborough County Public Records and they're going to say, who owns this piece of property? Well, it's a Florida LLC. All right, I'll go to Sunbiz. They go to Sunbiz and they look up the LLC and all they see is a Wyoming LLC. So they're like, all right, I'll go to the Wyoming Division of Corporations. Well, they go there, they hit a brick wall. Right. They don't see your name on it. And so could they find out who you are? Yes, they can sue, and eventually in litigation, they're going to find out who you are. But on a first level of defense, it looks like you own nothing. And for a lot of people, that makes them feel very comfortable.
Yeah, and I know I've talked to plaintiffs' attorneys, and I've talked to plaintiffs' attorneys on the show, and they say that, if they do that first level and nothing pops up, maybe they might do a little bit of a deeper dive. But they're typically plaintiffs' attorneys. I love them, but plaintiffs' attorneys want the deep pocket, and that's it. And if they can't find it, and to your point, a lot of times you'll look on Sunbiz for the Florida entity. And it's sunbiz.org for anybody that wants to check it out. But you'll look on Sunbiz for the Florida entity, and it'll name the Wyoming, whatever the Wyoming entity's name is, but it won't necessarily say that it's a Wyoming LLC. So it'll just name the LLC, and you don't know what state to go to. You'll type it in the Florida database, it's not there, and then you want to go to all 50 states and type that name in and see if you can find it.
And Wyoming, back to Wyoming, the reason we use them, they have really great charging order protections. And so even if they get a judgment in Florida and then they sue you in Wyoming and they get a judgment there, they're only entitled to the distributions from Wyoming. And with a properly drafted operating agreement and the Wyoming charging order protections, you could just turn off the distributions to yourself. If you're the one that's on the hot seat, you could hire your brother to be the manager and get the money out of the corporation or out of the entity to someone else who's not a subject of the charging order. And then there's another thing called phantom income, where it's a whole thing, but it's another reason why plaintiffs' attorneys don't like to go that far. And to your point, plaintiffs' attorneys they're working contingent. So Very different than a lot of us who are billing by the hour or by the project. So they don't collect on what they get a judgment for. They're going to collect on what they collect. So at the end of the day, if they have to jump through 3 or 4 hoops and spend 2 years of their life hunting down something that they may not ever see a penny from, or look at the insurance policy and go, well, we got $100,000 there. I can spend 10 hours and make $100,000, or I can spend 400 hours and maybe not make anything. I mean, if you were a business owner, which one would you choose?
Exactly.
I'll take the low-hanging fruit, thank you. So the idea behind anonymity planning and asset protection planning for businesses and business owners and real property owners is to just force the litigation to follow the money, and the readily available money is your insurance policy.
Right.
And so that's what insurance is for. That's why we pay for it, in case there is an issue and a claim. Let's let them dip into that pocket instead of coming after us personally.
Yeah, exactly. I had a real estate investor client that bought a piece of property. Now, he bought it in his name because he was financing it, and the bank didn't like putting the financing in the LLC of the land trust or whatever. So he would buy it in his name and then flip it into his LLC or land trust later. He closed on I want to say a Thursday. On Saturday, and it was a multi-unit building. On Saturday, somebody comes walking onto the property like full tactical gear, armed to the teeth. A love triangle between that guy and one of the female residents of the building who had her other guy at the apartment at the same time, or at the unit at the same time. The two guys literally get into a shootout. This is here in Tampa. Get into a shootout. The guy that comes onto the property, the aggressor with the guns and whatnot, gets shot in the leg. And I think he ended up being okay, but by, I think, Tuesday of the following week, my buddy gets a letter in the mail from, whatever billboard personal injury law firm. My client was injured when he entered your client's property. Now it ended up going away. He immediately tendered it to insurance. Insurance called the law firm and went, yeah, your guy came onto the property with guns. Go away. But it shows it happens from time to time. He didn't have time to move that property into his LLC before this altercation happened, and sure enough, got a letter from a plaintiff's lawyer.
So one of the things we do with Fortress is we're kind of the hub, and then we have kind of spokes that go off from that. So we really want to be kind of a one-stop shop for resources. Not that we do this work, but if you need tax advice, if you need someone to set up a retirement plan, a simple or a SEP plan, or a 401k for your small business, like we have those resources. We have property casualty insurances. We have lending resources.
Wow.
We're not the mortgage broker, but we do work with a lot of portfolio lenders that are more than happy to lend directly through a land trust or through an LLC, which is even better because then, again, going back to chain of title, your name never showed up. So for your buddy, he bought it in his own name. And then even if he flipped it to a land trust the next day, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to go, who's the current owner?
Right.
Let me look at the previous deed. Well, that guy just bought it. 3 days later, it was flipped to a, quote, anonymous entity for no consideration or no purchase price. Well, genius. That guy still owns it. He just now owns it in a land trust.
Right.
So if you have the right resources and you can get funding, you can get insurance through the land trust, through the LLC, those, in my opinion, and I'd love your opinion, Sean, it's probably a better mousetrap.
Oh, yeah. No, I totally agree. If you can get funded even hard money in a land trust or an LLC, that's going to provide you a lot more, both the anonymity and, I say to clients all the time when they ask me to form an LLC, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at Yesner law and figure out that Sean Yesner owns it. So, the same kind of analogy is that, how are you titling your LLC? Who are you listing on the LLC? Are you going that extra step to do the Wyoming LLC or the Nevada or the whatever? I tend to be more of a fan of keeping things local and keeping them in Florida, but I certainly understand there are circumstances, there are situations, asset protection, estate planning situations where you may want to go outside of the state. So, again, to remind everybody, it's Mortellaro Law, MORTELLARO Law, LAW.com, or FortressAssetProtection.com, exactly how it sounds, FortressAssetProtection.com. And again, I'll put those links in the notes so anybody that misses them, you can go to the notes and click on those links. But anything else? Anything I forgot to ask you? Anything you wanted to bring up?
No, just if you're a business owner, small business owner, or a partner or shareholder in a small corporation or company, do yourself a favor, do your family a favor. Find a local attorney in your jurisdiction that you feel comfortable with, whether they do both the estate planning and the business law side, or whether they work in a partnership or have some sort of other arrangement where you can get legal representation both on the entity side, the asset protection side, and estate planning. I think you will be much better suited and you'll be in much better position in the event something goes sideways than you were before getting educated and doing something affirmative.
Yeah. Something that you said triggered maybe one last question. I know I'm only licensed in Florida. I assume you're only licensed in Florida. So yes. On the legal side, we can only help people in Florida. Is Fortress beyond Florida's borders, or any plans to take it there?
Yeah, Fortress is. We would bring in local counsel as necessary because remember, Fortress is more of a business consultant.
Right.
And so it can operate by design pretty much anywhere. And then we would just work with in-state attorneys. But the concepts of asset protection are the same across the country. There may be some local rules and bells and whistles of how you set it up in a given jurisdiction based on their existing asset protection laws. But yes, and if we can't help you or we don't think it's a good fit, we're dedicated to helping you find someone in your area that may be a better fit for you.
Very cool. Well, Michelangelo, thank you again. I apologize it took so long to get you on the show, but thank you for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, so I think that'll do it for this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. Thank you all for listening. And like I like to say when I sign off, we hope that at the end of the month you have more money rather than at the end of the money you have more month. That'll do it for this week's episode. And we look forward to talking to you in next week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast.
If you have questions that you think would make a great topic for a future episode, please email Sean or connect with us on social media. Sean Yesner and Yesner Law, PL, are Florida licensed attorneys. The information contained in this week's episode is not a substitute for legal advice. Your situation may differ, especially if you are located somewhere other than the state of Florida. If you have questions, please contact our office or contact a local attorney. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast.